In the early 1920s, oil companies wanted access to Navajo land. The federal government needed someone it could treat as an authorized signer for leases. The Diné had community leaders, regional ties and political practices of their own, but Washington was looking for a body that fit its administrative system. In 1923, that pressure helped produce the Navajo Tribal Council. The origin matters because the modern Navajo Nation government did not appear as a simple gift from the United States. It grew through a difficult process in which federal officials, oil interests, Diné leaders, local communities, elections, and later reforms all shaped the outcome. The first council was created in a setting of unequal power. Over time, Diné people transformed and expanded political institutions into one of the largest indigenous governments in the United States. This is the question for this episode. Why was a formal Navajo council created in 1923? And how did an institution linked to mineral leasing become part of a much broader government of the Navajo Nation? The story begins with a distinction that is often missed. Diné political life did not begin in 1923. Families, clans, local leaders, and regional relationships existed long before federal officers drew district maps or scheduled elections. The 1868 treaty had established a reservation and a formal relationship with the United States, but it did not replace every Diné form of decision-making with a single Western-style government. The early 20th century brought increasing pressure to create a centralized body that federal agencies and corporations could recognize. Oil was one reason. The Navajo Nation's official history states that oil discovery on Navajo land in the early 1920s promoted the need for a more systematic form of government. Its public elections history adds a specific sequence. In 1921, a group described as a council signed oil and gas leases with the Midwest Refining Company. Those leases were cancelled, and a business council was organized. The federal concern was not merely abstract governance. Companies wanted clear authority to negotiate mineral access, and the Interior Department wanted an official body that could approve or certify leases. That origin should not be softened. The first modern council was connected to outside demand for resources beneath Diné land. It was not created after a nationwide Diné referendum asking for a new constitution. The Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission's historical material describes the 1922 Business Council as an entity imposed by the federal commissioner to sign coal leases. The exact institutional sequence in the early years involves business councils, district representation, and changing regulations. But the central point is clear. Resource extraction and federal administration were catalysts. The first formal Navajo Tribal Council met at Todolina, New Mexico, on July 27, 1923. The Navajo Nation Election Administration identifies Chi Dodge as the first elected chairman, serving until 1928 and later returning to the chairmanship. The council was structured through federal rules, with representatives and alternates drawn from districts. That structure gave the United States a single channel for dealing with leases, while also creating a new arena in which Diné representatives could argue about land, resources, and the nation's future. This double character is the heart of the story. The council began within an imposed system, but it was not permanently limited to the purpose its creators imagined. Once representatives met, debated, and carried concerns from communities, the institution could become more than a signature mechanism. It became a contested place of Navajo political life. To see why that mattered, imagine the paperwork behind a mineral lease. A company wants rights to explore or drill. Federal officials want a document with a legally recognized approval. A map divides land into parcels. A signature converts a proposed project into an agreement. Each step can make land look like an administrative surface. But land is never only a surface to the people who live with its water, grazing, homes, roads, and sacred responsibilities. The council's early history sits exactly at that collision between resource paperwork and lived territory. The Navajo Nation's current government still reflects the importance of resource decisions. Its public constitutional materials state that the council has authority to approve mineral, oil, and gas leases and other resource utilization agreements. That present authority did not erase the unequal beginning of 1923. It shows why the history is worth understanding. A body first connected to approving extraction later became part of the nation's ability to review, negotiate, tax, regulate, and refuse proposals on its own terms. The council did not immediately become a fully independent democratic institution. Federal officials continued to exercise extensive power through the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Secretary of the Interior. The early council's authority, membership and procedures were defined through regulations that came from outside the nation. The National Park Service's historic documentation of the council chamber notes that the council created in 1923 operated under secretarial regulations. This limit mattered. A council can be representative in some ways and still operate inside rules it did not write. The 1920s also brought a local political development that is easy to overlook: chapters. The Navajo Nation Election Administration explains that in 1927, the LOIP agency superintendent began encouraging local community organizations that became known as chapters. These meetings created places where people could discuss issues with representatives, public health workers, and agency personnel. Chapters were not simply miniature copies of the Central Council. They became a vital layer of local political participation, linking communities across a very large land base to broader Navajo government. This local layer changes the picture. If the story were only about a council created for oil leases, it would be too narrow. Diné governance developed through the tension between central administration and local voice. A chapter meeting could bring questions about water, roads, grazing, schools, health, and family welfare into a political system that otherwise risked speaking only in the language of federal departments and corporate contracts. The 1930s tested the legitimacy of the early council. Federal livestock reduction, which we examined in the previous episode, produced anger and distrust across the Navajo Nation. The election's history records that the council came into conflict with a significant part of the Navajo electorate during the stock reduction controversy. This was not a minor disagreement. It exposed a central problem. An institution associated with federal administration could be asked to support policies many Diné families experienced as devastating. The conflict shows why self-government cannot be measured only by whether a council exists. The harder questions are who chooses representatives, what authority they have, whose interests they can protect, and whether local people trust the process. An institution can use the language of representation while still being constrained by outside officials or disconnected from those it claims to represent. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt appointed John Collier as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Collier's New Deal-era policies promised a departure from earlier assimilation programs, but his relationship with the Navajo Nation was shaped by the livestock reduction crisis. The Navajo rejected the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, in part because people associated it with Collier and the reduction program. That rejection is a crucial correction to any story that treats federal reorganization as a straightforward path to empowerment. After the rejection, the federal government did not simply leave Navajo political development alone. The National Park Service's council chamber history describes pressure to reorganize the council through a constitutional assembly. In 1937, representatives gathered at Window Rock to draft a constitution. The proposed constitution was rejected by the Secretary of the Interior, but regulations issued in 1938 set out rules for the council's organization and election procedures. The council's membership expanded, and secret ballot procedures were introduced. This is not an easy success story. The federal government still held the power to approve or reject major institutional arrangements. Diné people were building a government while navigating rules that could change from Washington. Yet the period also gave the council a wider representative base and helped establish structures that later generations would reshape further. Window Rock became a visible symbol of this transformation. The circular council chamber, built in the 1930s, is more than a tourist landmark. It is a physical record of an emerging central government. The Navajo Nation describes its walls as carrying murals of Navajo history, and its public symbols as linking livestock, homes, agriculture, natural resources, and sovereignty. The building does not tell a story of unbroken independence. It shows an institution occupying a space between federal influence and Diné political growth. The modern Navajo Nation government is often described as a three-branch system: executive, legislative, and judicial. The Navajo Nation says this structure was reorganized in 1991. The date matters because it reminds us that government did not stop evolving in the 1920s or 1930s. The council's early resource lease function became one chapter in a longer process of developing law, elections, courts, departments, and community representation. That development also changed the way resource decisions could be made. In 1974, the Navajo Tribal Council established a tax commission to study sources of income and taxation. In 1978, the council approved taxes on business activity and possessory interests. When companies challenged the nation's authority, the Supreme Court's 1985 decision in Kerr-McGee v. Navajo tribe upheld the nation's ability to tax non-Navajo businesses operating on tribal land. The Navajo Nation now marks that decision as an important sovereignty milestone. The link back to 1923 is direct. The original council emerged because companies wanted lease agreements. Decades later, Navajo institutions were asserting the authority to tax and regulate business activity on their land. That does not make the two moments equivalent. The first was shaped by federal control and outside extraction pressure. The later tax case involved the nation defending a power of self-government. But the contrast shows how political institutions can be remade through long struggle. Resource questions remain complex today. The Navajo Nation has public policies and departments responsible for reviewing energy proposals, mineral development, land use, water, and environmental impacts. Its current energy policy recognizes petroleum, natural gas, coal, uranium, and other fuel minerals as subjects of nation-level review. This is not simply a continuation of the 1920s. It is a different legal and political environment, with modern environmental concerns, regulatory systems, and Diné institutions exercising authority that did not exist in the same form a century ago. There is an important evidence limit here. A historical documentary cannot claim that every resource decision made by the Navajo government is either fully sovereign or fully controlled from outside. Real governance includes negotiation, disagreement, economic need, legal constraints, and community debate. The record supports a more useful conclusion. The nation's political institutions have been shaped by resource pressure from the beginning, and Diné leaders and communities have repeatedly worked to expand their ability to make decisions themselves. The title question now has a clear answer. The United States created a formal Navajo Council in 1923, largely because federal officials and oil companies wanted a recognized body to authorize mineral leases. That origin was tied to the extraction of wealth from Navajo land. But the institution did not remain only a lease-signing mechanism. Through elections, chapters, reorganization, legal conflict, and continued political participation, it became part of the framework of modern Navajo governance. The council's beginning is not a reason to reduce the Navajo Nation to oil. Diné political life is broader than any resource history. It includes families, chapters, language, land, law, education, health, livestock, water, and many forms of community responsibility. Yet the origin story matters because it reveals the conditions under which the federal government was prepared to recognize a centralized Navajo authority, when access to resources required a signature. The most revealing visual is not an oil derrick alone. It is an old lease map beside the circular council chamber at Window Rock. The map represents the outside demand that helped create the early council. The chamber represents a government that Diné people have developed, debated, and reshaped across generations. Between them is the real story, not a simple transfer of power, but an ongoing struggle to turn an imposed administrative requirement into institutions that can serve the Navajo Nation. The historical answer also tells us what the evidence does not establish. It does not mean the 1923 Council replaced older Diné political traditions. It does not mean every early representative agreed with federal policy. It does not mean modern Navajo government has solved every dispute over resources, and it does not mean a corporate interest in oil can explain all of Navajo political history. What it establishes is precise and consequential. Oil exploration created urgent pressure for a legally recognized Navajo signing authority. The federal government helped establish a council in that context. Diné people then lived with, challenged, expanded, and transformed the institution. The resulting government is not a relic of 1923. It is a modern political system whose history still contains the record of why it began. That is why the creation of the Navajo Tribal Council deserves to be remembered. It shows how paperwork can be a form of power. It shows how a signature sought by outsiders can become the starting point for a larger claim to self-government. And it shows that sovereignty is not a single event. It is built, defended, debated, and revised over time by the people whose land and future are at stake. The early lease dispute helps explain why formal authority mattered so much to the federal government. A company cannot easily invest in exploration if it is unclear who can approve an agreement. Federal officials wanted a council whose decision could be filed, recognized, and enforced through the administrative law of the day. That requirement translated a complex nation into a familiar corporate and bureaucratic form. A named body, officers, minutes, resolutions, and signatures. The convenience of that form for Washington does not tell us whether it reflected every Diné community's preferred way of making decisions. Chi Dodge's documented role gives this period a human point of reference, but it should not turn the history into a biography. He was the first elected chairman of the council created in 1923, and his name appears in Navajo Nation election history. We should not invent his private motives, claim he personally controlled every lease decision, or use him as a stand-in for the entire nation. His role shows something narrower. Early council politics involved Diné leaders working inside an institution whose rules and purpose had been heavily shaped by federal pressure. Representation also had a geographic problem. The Navajo Nation covers a vast area across Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. People lived far from agency offices and travelled across difficult terrain. A single central council could not automatically know conditions in every community. That is one reason chapters became important. Local meetings created a route by which an issue could move from a community to a delegate and then to the council. The system was imperfect, but it made the government more than a distant office handling leases. The council chamber's location at Window Rock is significant for the same reason. A capital concentrates records, meetings, departments, and public symbols in one place. It can make government visible. But visibility can also create distance. The strength of the Navajo political system lies not only in the chamber or the council itself, it lies in the continuing connection between chapters, representatives, courts, executive offices, and the people who hold them accountable. This is why the history of local organization belongs beside the history of oil. The 1930s reorganization shows that institutional design was never settled. The council changed in response to conflict, federal policy, and Diné political participation. The secret ballot, wider representation, and new regulations mattered because they altered who could speak through the formal system. Yet reforms issued or approved by federal officials also reveal the limit of the period. Self-government was being assembled in a field where the United States still claimed the authority to define the rules. That tension did not disappear overnight. The later three-branch reorganization was therefore more than a bureaucratic update. Separating executive, legislative, and judicial functions created clearer locations for different kinds of authority. A council debates and passes legislation. An executive branch carries out programs. Courts interpret laws and decide cases. These categories do not resolve political disagreement, but they give a government more ways to act independently of a federal agency's day-to-day direction. The Navajo Nation's modern structure is the result of that longer institutional work. Resource governance also became more than lease approval. The nation's public tax history shows a progression from studying potential revenue to adopting taxes, defending them in court, and exercising authority over businesses on tribal land. Taxes may sound technical, but they answer a practical political question. When value is created through activity on Navajo land, can the Navajo Nation raise revenue for its own public purposes? The Supreme Court decision in 1985 affirmed that the nation could do so without outside approval in the case before it. That legal victory should not be oversold. It did not erase federal trust obligations, solve environmental damage, or guarantee that every resource project would benefit every community. It did establish an important principle of jurisdiction. For a government whose early formal counsel had been tied to outside companies seeking signatures, the ability to tax businesses on Navajo land marked a major shift in the balance of authority. The present-day lesson is not that all development is either progress or betrayal. Diné communities and elected institutions face real choices about jobs, revenue, water, energy, cleanup, and protection of land. Those choices can produce disagreement because the stakes are real. The historical record of 1923 gives viewers a way to ask better questions. Who has authority? Who benefits? What rules govern the decision? What community voice is present? And how can a nation prevent the needs of outside companies from becoming the only reason government institutions are recognized? When those questions are asked, the story of the council becomes much richer than a date on a timeline. It becomes a history of adaptation under pressure. Diné people did not choose the conditions that made federal officials want a lease-signing body. But they did not remain passive inside the structure that emerged. They elected representatives, built local chapters, challenged federal policies, expanded government functions, and asserted jurisdiction. The council's origin is a record of constraint. Its evolution is a record of political work.